Hello everybody, I'm Don Cipollini. I'm a professor of biology at Wright State University and a resident of Yellow Springs, Ohio. And in this episode of The Naturalist, I'm going to take a walk around Pearl's Fen and tell you a little bit about what I see. All right, so let's go. So let's take a walk along the boardwalk at Pearl's Fen and take a look at what we see. There's a lot of interesting plants in this area, and this is a nice time of the day to see the plants and insects that visit them and so forth. This is August 22nd, 2023, and it's a nice, moderately warm day, although it's going to get very hot in the next few days. And here's a plant right away that's a real feature of Pearl's Fen, and it's called obedient plant or false dragonhead. And these nice light lavender flowers, very pretty, and it's an absolute pollinator magnet. As I look at this plant, I'm seeing honeybees, I see bumblebees, I see other solitary bees. I see beetles, moths, flies. It's just awash with activity right now. So this is a real hit with the pollinators. And it's an interesting plant as well because of one of its features. So this plant's called obedient plant because of this special thing you can do with its flowers. Okay, so let's take a look carefully at one of its flowers. And what you can do with it is move the flowers around the stem and they'll stay where you put them. Okay, so the flower obeys me. You can see I'm competing with some bumblebees right here, gathering nectar from these flowers. But that makes obedient plant unique. You can move the flowers around the stem and they stay where you put them. They don't break. Most plants that you would do that to would either break or get deformed. And so kind of cool, really interesting feature of this plant. And it's just amazing as I stand here to watch the pollinator activity. Some of these plants are coated with beetles, small beetles, which I'm not sure what they are, but honeybees, bumblebees, moths, just mobbing this plant. Well, right on cue in the background there too, I see a monarch butterfly flying around. And again, that butterfly will take nectar off of lots of different plants, although the host plants for its larvae are milkweeds and milkweed relatives. So hopefully we'll come across some of those. Here's a plant nearby, this big patch of obedient plant. This is called Joe Pye weed. And with these sort of light purplish light lavender flowers, these plants, most of the plants we're seeing today are associated with wetlands or moist soils, wet prairies and meadows and those kinds of places. So this one's Joe Pye weed, also a really pretty plant in flower right now. And clearly the obedient plant is peaking at the moment, and it's just beautiful. There's some goldenrod you can see in front of me here that is flowering. Okay, it's a little farther along than some of the other individuals I'm seeing. There are several species of goldenrod here. I'm not going to distinguish between them, but goldenrod's a really important plant for biodiversity. It's abundant in meadows and prairies and roadsides. It's native. It can get a little aggressive. Sometimes goldenrods can take over prairie restorations, but it is a very valuable plant for biodiversity, native biodiversity. It does get a bad rap in the fall sometimes, but it's unfair because people associate goldenrod with allergies and allergy season and hay fever and so forth, but that's a myth, okay? The pollen of goldenrod is sticky. It's collected and moved around by insects. Okay, it does not fly through the air. So it's not a component of the dust and pollen that you breathe and that would trigger allergies in people who have hay fever. So even though it gets a bad rap, it's not warranted. That's a nice patch of Joe Pye. There's some another purplish flower in there we'll see up close later called ironweed. I'll try to point that out later. Something we have in front of us here, the white flower, is called boneset. Okay, another wetland associated plant. And that plant's been given its name because it supposedly could help heal broken bones. You know, a lot of these plants had purported medicinal qualities. Some of that might be true. Some of it's not. Hasn't really been tested scientifically. But they're herbal remedies from way back. And they've retained those names and those reputations in many cases. Okay, so here's a spot at Pearl's Fen where the loop begins. So we'll start out by heading left and take a look at what we see. Here's a plant that I've also see quite commonly on these walks. And it's also a pollinator magnet. It's covered by bees. And it has basically little wings on its stems. Okay, and so this plant is called wing stem because of that. It's very convenient. Okay, another yellow flowered late fall wildflower. Many of these plants, again, are related. They're in the aster family. So goldenrods, wing stem, the cup plant that we saw, these are all relatively close relatives, and many members of that family flower in late season, late summer and fall. There will be plants flowering here also through deep into fall. Okay, this site, as part of its restoration, you know, there had been woody plant encroachment into this fen site, and I will soon describe what a fen is exactly. So part of the restoration of the site was to get rid of some of those trees that were unwanted. Then, of course, there were trees that were killed by things like emerald ash borer that died naturally. But part of the restoration was to open this area back up and let the broadleaf herbaceous wildflowers and grasses that were here to thrive, as long with bringing in additional seed and plants to restore plants that would have been here that had gone away. Some of the trees that do remain include black walnut. Okay, so here's a plant in front of me, and these are the green developing husks of black walnuts. Okay, the nut is inside this green husk. That husk will turn dark brown or black later in the fall when they fall off the tree. Okay, and the nut's inside. Black walnut's one of our most valuable trees. It's very important for wildlife. There, a squirrel just jumped out of one in front of me. Very valuable for wildlife. It's also one of our most valuable hardwoods in terms of construction of, you know, cabinets and flooring and things like that, furniture. So we have a lot of black walnut in this area, and that's good. That's a good thing. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of interesting vegetation. Here's one that's always been a favorite of mine, and this plant is called spotted jewelweed. Okay, or orange spotted jewelweed. These are the flowers. Okay, these are visited by hummingbirds in many cases. They really like these flowers. And once those flowers get pollinated, start to set seed and develop a seed pod, a pod grows that is fun to play with. When it matures, it becomes about a ½ an inch long. I'll pick one, take a look at it. About a ½ an inch long, and it becomes more football shaped, and inside that pod there'll be 2 or 3 seeds. But it's basically a spring loaded seed dispersal mechanism. When that pod gets larger and mature, this sort of vegetative spring that grows inside that pod, upon, you know, basically touch at the right time of maturity, that pod will explosively burst open and disperse the seeds, 6 or 8 feet away from the parent plant. So it's a real interesting seed dispersal mechanism. That gives rise to the other name for this plant called touch-me-not. And when I was a kid, this provided hours of fun. So touch-me-nots or jewel weed. Now this plant also has very soft, fleshy stems that you can crush, and you can easily extract juice out of them. And this plant has, again, purported anti-itch qualities. So you can apply this sap to, say, poison ivy, where you have poison ivy, and that'll alleviate some of your itching. So here's a very large patch of jewelweed in front of me here. Again, a wetland-associated plant, sort of likes intermediate light, half sun, half shade, moist soils. Okay, on my right we have more of our Joe Pye weed, nice lavender color, intermixed with some bone set. Again, the white flower. Mixture of goldenrods. This time of year, you get a real nice mixture of yellows and purples that kind of signify fall to me. Okay, this boardwalk is just a couple of feet off the ground, if that even, just enough to keep you out of the ground when the soil's moist. But it's a really easy walk. It's a short walk and worth your time. Okay, we have more wing stems. Oh, there went, to try to see what it was. There went a raptor of some sort. It was on the ground. Didn't really get a close look at it, but just an example of the kinds of things you can encounter when you visit this site. So here's a fun plant. This white plant in front of me, which displays these white flowers on spikes. This is called Canada Burnet. And my students have nicknamed this thing the fuzzy hot dog plant. I think you can see why. And so this is a fun wetland associated plant, Canada Burnet, one of the white flowers you would see out here. Okay, as we approach this area, this is an area where there's some signage describing exactly what a fen is and what kind of fen we have here. This is called a mound fen, all right? So basically what a fen is a groundwater fed wetland, fed by spring water. And this area where there's a little bridge at Pearl's Fen, in which about 5 frogs just jumped into, illustrates that pretty clearly, okay? So again, fens, groundwater fed, there's water bubbling up from aquifers below pretty continuously throughout the year. Very steady in temperature, keeps this place cool in the summer, and relatively warm in the winter. Here the waters are near neutral, or just slightly acidic, 6.8 pH or so. And if you look at the sediments here, the sediments are very black, which represent hydric soil that is built up, that's full of peat and organic matter common to wetland areas. We call it hydric soil. But there are specks of white in the sediment if you get here and look closely, and that's the calcium carbonate that's common to this area. It's representative or derived from our limestone bedrock, and which again contributes to the neutral pH of the soils and water. And those specks we call marl, M-A-R-L. and that's pretty common to fens in the Midwest. I'm seeing a lot of frogs swimming around, water striders on the water. In front of me too is one of our nice locally common oak species. Okay, this oak species is called chinkapin oak. Okay, it's very leathery, dark green and glossy on the upper side, and very whitish and pale on the underside. Okay, it doesn't have lobes like you might expect in an oak tree, like a white oak or a red oak. It's more serrated, okay, and it actually has little pointy tips on those serrations. Okay, that makes it kind of unique, especially for the group that it's part of. But this is kind of a Midwestern oak, often associated with soils that have a limestone bedrock. Okay, and so here's some developing acorns, okay, from the successfully pollinated flowers. So chinkapin oak, pretty common oak here in Ohio. Okay, here's the downstream view. Again, showing that cool spring water that gives rise to this fen. Again, a fen is in contrast to wetlands that are fed by surface water or precipitation, things that we call marshes or swamps or bogs. Those are different, okay? The key is that a fen is a groundwater fed wetland. This is a beautiful view. As I look down this little stream, there's lots of different species of plants, some of which we've seen so far and others we haven't yet. But I'll try to get close to some of them. Here on my right is a nice patch of black-eyed Susans. I think a lot of people recognize these flowers. These are commonly planted in gardens. This is a wild strain, typically. A lot of the flowers we're seeing, there might be cultivated strains or cultivars, we call them, varieties that have been bred to have some features people like in their yard, maybe more compact, larger flower heads, things like that. But they're still relatively similar to the native species they were derived from. So again, black-eyed Susan, both wild varieties exist and cultivated varieties. Okay, as we get out here, I see a plant called white snakeroot that is setting up to flower soon. It would be a white flower, and it's not quite there, but it's getting there. Then we see a variety of our grasses that are representative of meadows and prairies. And this one, I've pointed out in past talks, is called big blue stem or turkeyfoot grass, okay, named for the turkeyfoot-like inflorescence. This is the flowering head of a grass. So this is one of the key components of the tall grass prairie. Here's a plant that's a little bit more diminutive with tiny flowers, but nonetheless important. This is a Virginia mountain mint, and it's in the mint family. And if you ever get up close to a plant in the mint family, feel the stem. The stem will be square. That's a key characteristic of the mint family. And so this makes a pretty little whitish or lavender almost like flower that's quite visited by pollinators, usually small pollinators, and right on cue, there's a honeybee that landed. But it's a pretty little plant, a little more diminutive than these other things we've been seeing, but important nonetheless. Here's one of my favorites of wetlands. And this plant right here, this plant is called swamp thistle. Okay, so this is a native plant, native thistle, nice light purple lavender head, and with this base around it that is sticky. That's a characteristic of swamp thistle. All right, and again, this is a native plant, important for biodiversity. There are problematic non-native relatives that become agricultural weeds or roadside weeds, weeds in pastures, so we're not looking to promote those. But there are some nice native thistle species that we should be protecting and praising, like this one, swamp thistle. Okay, here's a plant. This is a woody plant that represents a wetland-associated shrub. This is a willow. So most willows, and there are a variety of species of willow in Ohio, are associated with wetlands or stream sides or riverbanks. They like moist soils. I see over here some goldenrods that are, again, in the process of flowering, farther ahead of some of their neighbors. And you can see the little pollinators visiting. I see a lot of small wasps on this one. Hoverflies are visiting, just indicating the value of these things for native biodiversity. Okay, I'm heading back east on this short boardwalk. Here's a flower in front of me called Great Blue Lobelia. Okay, nice darker blue or purple flowers. Here's one as well. Okay. In this area, we see a couple of different things. This small shrubby plant, actually, here's one that looks a little bit better. This small shrub is called shrubby cinquefoil, okay, and it is a more of a woody kind of structure to its stems, a low shrub associated with wetlands. This is also one that will be planted horticulturally, you know, along parking lot edges and in landscaping and so forth. So shrubby cinquefoil. Then in this area, these kind of wiry looking plants with skinny leaves in front of me are sedges. Probably a couple different species of sedges here. And sedges are typically wetland plants. There's a large variety of species. And so sedges are really important wetland plants. There's a little monarch floating around in front of me. It just landed on a touch-me-not. Take a look at it. Okay, monarchs, again, their larvae feed on milkweeds, which are toxic. And because of adaptations they exhibit that allow them to feed on a toxic plant, they can accumulate those toxins in their skins, in their bodies, and it makes the larvae and the adults toxic themselves. And interestingly, that leads to a behavior pattern where they float and flutter. They're slow flyers because they're toxic and they know it, and they advertise that. There are other species that mimic monarchs, but they fly a lot faster because they're actually not toxic, and they have to fly faster to avoid predators in case they get found out. Things like the viceroy butterfly. All right, right in front of me is your classic wetland plant. It's a cattail. Okay, that brown hot dog you're witnessing there is the plant you see in front of me is cattail. Very classic wetland associated plant, named after the shape of that developing seed head there. Okay, so that brown hot dog you see there is a mass of seeds that are developing. If you were to break that apart, it's fluffy. Okay, the seeds are attached to a little strand of fluff that helps them fly away from the parent plant and disperse the seeds. Okay, more swamp thistle, shrubby cinquefoil. Here's an area in the distance where I can see a lot of goldenrods starting to flower. More jewelweed out there, some cattails. Real mixture of colors and heights. It's really interesting right now. Here's a goldenrod species. It's a little bit behind, hasn't begun flowering yet, but will soon. Here's an important plant I'd like to talk about. This is called elderberry. Okay, elderberries, this is a small shrub associated with wet, moist soils. And this is edible. Okay, so elderberries, you can make juice out of them, jelly, jam. You can make wine out of them. They have purported medicinal qualities as well. And these aren't completely ripe. They turn a little darker purple and almost black when they're completely ripe. But they're close. They're within a week or so of being ripe. And they're fairly common in this particular area. One thing I wanted to say about wetland restoration as we look across here is that the other thing you have to do to get wetlands back is disrupt any drainage systems that might have existed. Like here in Ohio, our agricultural fields are largely drained. Okay, they have tiling systems under the ground, a huge network that feed into either ditches or detention basins and eventually into streams to get the water off the field as quickly as possible so it can be farmed, okay, or pastured. And when you try to restore an area where that's occurred, and there used to be part of this land here that was farmed, you have to break up that system, that tiling system, and get the water to stay on the land. In many cases, if you do that, you will start to get back wetland and the associated plants that belong here naturally. But often you have to help things along, which has been done here, a mixture of both. I see several monarch butterflies flying around here right at the moment, even though I'm not seeing a lot of their host plant for their larvae. Not that many milkweeds at the moment right here. There's a mass of touch-me-nots. See if we can find a pod that's farther along. No, I think they're too immature right now. So here's a rose species in here, a native rose species. It's well past flowering, but I can see that its fruits are being formed. Okay, and then we're now back to where the loop joins the start. And there's maybe just a couple more plants I'll point out back in this direction. This is a goldenrod relative setting up to flower. But this woody shoot behind us here is a cottonwood. Okay, it's a young cottonwood tree. There's a larger one in the background right there. Okay, so that's cottonwood itself is a wetland associated tree. You typically find these lining rivers and streams that are growing around wetlands because they really like moist soils. They grow extremely fast and can get extremely large. And so that right there is probably 1 year's growth on that tree. I believe this area was cut in this past year. Beyond the cottonwood, I see a tiger swallowtail at the moment. Okay, and here's maybe one of the last plants I'm going to point out. This is called blue vervain. Really pretty, bright, light purple flowers on a spike-like inflorescence. And again, a characteristic of wetlands or wet soils, ditches, stream sides. And just really contributes nicely to this color palette we have here. Whites, pinks, oranges, yellows, purples, and so forth. and we're going to heading back toward the parking area. And the last thing I'll point out is birds and other wildlife. I'm seeing a lot of goldfinches, bright golden birds that feed on the seeds of many of these large prairie plants, or thistles they like. Very common to see them this time of year flitting about the fen or prairies, meadows. Any place that has these sorts of plants, you can find goldfinches this time of year. So that concludes this episode of The Naturalist, my walk around Pearl's Fen. Glad you could join me, and till next time, take care.